Hello and welcome to everyone listening to the Written Melanin Podcast, the place where you come to get your weekly dose of melanated creativity. I'm your host, CM Lockhart, an author of fantasy books featuring Black girls who aren't all that nice, and the owner of the Melanin Library, an online database of books written by Black authors. And in this space, I invite you to listen to the journeys of Black authors as they navigate all routes of publishing. I'm glad you're here. And today, you guys, I am here with Sarah Everett. She is the author of several critically acclaimed novels for teens and young readers. Her book, The Probability of Everything, won the 2023 Governor General's Literary Award, as well as the NCTE's Charlotte Huck Award. When she is not reading or writing, she is dreaming about summer, gearing up for her next travel adventure, perfecting her tree pose, or bowling with her dog. And her latest novel, The Shape of Lost Things, is out October 22nd, 2024. And slight plug, you guys, I have been reading an arc of this, and it is such a heartwarming, it's middle grade, and y'all know I'm grown, but I'm actually having a really good time with it. So I can give my personal little recommendation at the beginning of this in case y'all don't listen to the rest of it, because I know how y'all do sometimes. So
Thanks, Chelsea.
that being said, welcome, Sarah.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on. So for those of you listening to this, I want you to know that I was telling Sarah off camera that the first book I ever picked up when I was in my, deep, I want to read more Black authors, like right at the beginning, before the Melanin Library, before Written in Melanin, before I wrote Keeping Promises, any of that, I picked up Everyone We've Been, and it's still on my shelf. And so the world has come full circle. Just know that this journey has come full circle, and I'm excited about it.
It's been so long since Everyone We've Been, but that's so nice to hear you read it.
Yeah. So that being said, before I get into the gushing and all of the questions that I have for you, in your own words, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. So I'm Sarah Everett. I am the author of a bunch of books for teens and recently some books for younger readers. I live in Canada, Western Canada, Alberta, and I love greyhounds and I love traveling and I really like Twizzlers. I don't know. I think that's me in a nutshell.
I love it. I love it. Travel, Twizzlers, and writing.
Yeah.
I feel like that's the core, top 3 things that make up Sarah. So that being said, let's just go ahead and jump straight into this, right? Let's talk about your author journey because, like you said, you have several books under your belt and you have successfully written not only for young adult, but for middle grade. And I know that for several authors, sometimes that age range shift, whether it's going from young adult to middle grade or young adult to adult, sometimes that can be challenging. So, can you tell us about your journey, just from writing your first book to winning an award to having 5 going on 6 books under your belt? How do we get here?
Sure. So to go all the way back, I've always loved reading and writing, and I grew up pretty much writing like whatever I could, like poetry, songs, really terrible songs, but like whatever I could, I would write. I loved writing fan fiction, and that sort of progressed to me wanting to try my hand at books when I was a little bit older. And after I wrote my first book, I kind of fell in love with the process. And around my fourth book, I decided to query and see how far that would take me. I was lucky to get the attention of my agent, Susie Townsend, who I'm still with. And since then, we've sold a bunch of books. And as Chelsea said, I just hopscotched over from YA to middle grade. And that is turning out really well. I love writing middle grade. And yeah, it's been a nice adventure.
I love that. So, from your perspective, what do you think is one of the biggest difference between trying to writing a book for young adult versus writing one for middle grade?
Yeah, so somebody asked me the other day, what is it that makes you like writing middle grade? And the only answer I could think of is that it's just such an earnest age. Like it's an age where everything is so like big-hearted and open, and there's so much change happening and self-discovery. And a lot of that is the same in YA, but I think there's a little bit more optimism and openness in middle grade. There's a lot more focus on family, which I always love writing about. And so those things kind of are what drew me to middle grade. I'll also say that how I originally started middle grade is not so much like an intentional decision, like I'm going to go write middle grade, but I had this idea for a novel, Probability of Everything. And as the voices descended in my mind, it was really clear to me that it wasn't a YA novel and it wasn't an adult novel. So then I was like, I think this is middle grade. And from there I started reading and researching, and yeah, and pretty soon I started my first draft of the novel. Yeah, like that's kind of how I fell into it.
I love to hear that because, one of the things that you said is like, middle grade feels so big hearted. And as I was reading, The Shape of Lost Things, it just kind of reminded me and kind of brought me back to, being that age, being in middle school. And it's just like, everything feels like the most important, biggest thing ever
Yeah.
at that age, And so I think you captured that really well
Mm.
because it's just like, especially with how she sees her friends, and she's like, she used to be an elephant, but she's not anymore. And it's just like that shouldn't make sense. And if you're listening to this, you're like, Chelsea, what are you talking about? Is this an inside joke? It's not an inside joke. You got to read the book. Okay. It makes sense if you read the book. But it's just this idea of how you see people, and it's kinda like the equivalent of how people are like, "Oh, you have, like, a pink aura,"
Mm.
or something like that, and you change, but the way she experiences life in just in general, I'm just like, "Oh, this is this is sweet." And I think the other thing that I've been enjoying is that, in adult, novels, right, family is usually more so recognizing the toxic aspects of it and healing from it, whereas middle grade is just like, "No, your mom is still really dope." You know? You still are like, family is great, and it's still very rooted in that,
Mhm.
and I also like that because it's just like it's a nice reminder that, even as adults, it's a reminder that, at one point, we were 100% in with this family thing and we loved them,
Yeah,
you
for
know?
sure. Yeah, no, I
Uh,
I definitely, for me, that's one of the huge draws of writing middle grade is just that family connection and, like, even sibling relationships, and I just love writing in that space just because there's so much emphasis on who you're becoming and how, like, your family informs that. So, yeah, yeah, I agree.
I'm here for it, I'm here for it, but you mentioned that you fell in love with the process of writing, so can you tell us what your process is like?
Hmm. That's kind of a hard question because I feel like I don't have a process, but I mean, I've been doing this a while, so I should have a better answer to that question. I'm definitely an idea driven writer in the sense that I'll get an idea, sit on it for a little while, and then the right character sort of starts percolating in my mind. And then I'll sit down and write a little, like maybe a paragraph of what description of what the book is going to be about, and then go away, percolate on that a little bit more, and then come back and write a very loose outline. And then I'll dive in and get started writing. I try not to edit as I go. That's something that I've been working on is like not going back to what I wrote yesterday because I can tinker with it forever. But
Yeah.
recently I've just been like, okay, you're going to write from start to finish. You're not going to look back. And that's been working out better for me. Yeah, and that's kind of my process. I'm really lucky that I'm working full time as a writer at the moment, and that sort of informed a lot of my process because it's sort of like it's my job, so it's what I do all day, and I try to like set hours and 9 to 5 still. And but of course, like because it's so flexible, there'll be like appointments in between and everything. It's just sort of about coming back to that space and being like, okay, I need to write and I need to get this done and I need to hit this deadline. And yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because I know that sometimes people listen and they're like, okay, but that's not my reality. And it's always one of those things that I personally am always an advocate for. It's just like, being able to do something full time, right? And being able to do something during your daytime hours and give most of your brain energy to that versus having to do something after you've worked a full time job and you have, I don't say what's left of your time, but essentially what's left of your time that is very different.
Mm.
So I love that you're very straightforward about that. But it also sounds like you're a planner, which I think is, I love that for you. I'm such a pantser and I'm like, I have to make this up as I go along. Otherwise, my brain will be like, oh, we already did that. We already traveled that route if I try to make a plan. So I'm just slightly jealous. It's totally fine though. It's totally fine.
No, I call myself a planter. I stole it from somewhere, but it's like it's a little bit of plotting, a little bit of pantsing, and it's just like, kind of like put it together, try to figure it out as you're going. Like that's yeah, I do a little bit of both.
Okay. Respect. Respect. I'm very much like any outline is like no.
Yeah.
My manuscript just laughs in my face like ha 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 ha. You thought, but since The Shape of Lost Things is not your first middle grade, it's not your middle grade debut.
Mm.
So you are now in. I guess this would be what your sophomore novel,
Sophomore, yeah.
sophomore debut.
Yeah.
Okay, look at me trying to get like writerly industry terms under my belt, but can you tell us about The Probability of Everything? Because that book has won you several awards.
Mm. Yeah, probability of everything is to give people a little bit of an idea what it's about. It's about a girl who she loves science, she loves probability, and unfortunately there's an asteroid that's headed to Earth and she goes on this mission to put together a time capsule so that her family is remembered by the next Earthlings. And that's a little spiel that I give. And yeah, it's been a really special process. Like I feel like I've been doing this a while. Like I've written a few books and it's not always like sometimes you just debut or like come out to crickets. And other times there's a little bit more attention and people seem to care more what you're saying and like they care a little bit more about the story. And that's sort of been my experience more with Probability of Everything is it's definitely been the book that has gotten the most attention and the most acclaim of everything that I've done. So it's special to me for that reason, but it's special to me for the process of writing it. Like the idea came from a personal place in my life, and I started writing it more than a decade ago. And so it's been a long process, and seeing it on the shelves finally and having people like be open and like accept it the way they have, all of that has been really gratifying and really exciting. So yeah, I'm glad.
I'm honestly kind of glad to hear that, just like personally, because one of the things that I've talked about is that my first novel, We Are the Origin, it lived with me for like 10
Mm.
years, right? And so when you were talking about it, it's just like I understand that 100% when a story just like lives with you until you're able to get it on the page. And it's also this idea that it kind of lives with you. I don't know if this is like your experience as well, but maybe it is. But it's just like when you know that you have the story and you want to tell it and it's living with you, but you're like, it's not ready yet.
Mm.
It needs to percolate a
Yeah.
little bit more,
Yeah.
you know? Was that how it was with The Probability of
Oh,
Everything?
100%. Yeah. I started trying to write it like when I did have the idea for it. I sat down and I would write like a couple of lines every couple of years or a few months. Like I would just write an extra line, but the story itself wasn't really going anywhere. I just couldn't, like, I just wasn't in the place to sit down and write the full thing. So, yeah, so it's sort of like time and maturity and just space away from the sort of genesis of the story, all those things make it easier to like go back and tell the actual story that I wanted to tell. Yeah, so sometimes it takes a while for a book to come to life, and that's the case with this one.
Absolutely. And I feel like I want to add to that if you are listening to this, I think one of the things that as
authors, a lot of ideas and stories and things come from, like you said, our lived experience. It sparks an idea, even when it ends up in fantasy or fiction or takes on a different shape so that we can tell it, right?
Yeah.
I think it's also really important sometimes to remember that as authors, we're people. And so that even when you have an idea, sometimes you have to heal from it before you can add it into something. And, I speak from personal experience and I'm not going to get super deep into that. Sometimes you can't write your character getting through something until you yourself have gotten through it
Mhm.
and you're like, I know what's on the other side of this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that being said, let's talk about the shape of lost things because something I want to ask, are you just like naturally into science because the probability of everything and the shape of lost things both have very heavy scientific themes throughout it. Like they're fun, but
Yeah. So I do have a little bit of a science background. Like my undergraduate degree is in science. And so I worked in science for a bit. I was like a research assistant. And so I do have an affinity for science. But what's funny is that I never, like with probability, I was like, I'm going to write a book that features science. And then with Shape of Lost Things, I remember I was doing, I think it was like an interview a few weeks ago, and the person was like, "And so this one features science as well." And I was like, "Oh, does it?" And then I sort of realized like, "Oh yeah, like I've done it again." I don't know. I think that as authors, we keep going back to the same well a lot of times because
mhm.
like you said, our lived experience informs what we write about. And so because I not know science, but because I sort of think about science a lot and I'm immersed in science, I keep going back to those stories and telling them in different ways. And, I don't think all my books are going to feature science, but there might always be some sort of connection.
No, I mean, that makes sense. I think it's the same reason why, for a lot of stories, we often get characters who enjoy reading and are kind of, introverts and things like that. Because as authors, a lot of us who end up working very introverted jobs, such as sitting at a desk by yourself writing about imaginary characters,
Yes.
you, we usually have very connected aspects of like elements of our childhood,
Mm,
right? Same way as you might find that with, like athletes, a lot of them like to play sports when they were little, or they grew up watching sports with a parent
mhm,
or someone that they respected, right? You have those connecting threads. And so I personally think it's kind of nice that in the Shape of Lost things, Sky, she's got hobbies that are just like they're just different from what you would normally get from authors who are like, I love to read when I was a kid. It's like Sky likes to take pictures and her mom's a physicist and she walks the neighborhood dogs and she's like, I would very much be happy just sitting at home, but that is not allowed. So I have to be busy.
yeah.
And so it's just like there are elements of her that I'm just like, she feels like a genuine like middle schooler. And it's just like I love this. Even with her whole relationship with Nico in the beginning, and she's like, no. And it's just like, it's fine. It's fine, girl. You're gonna grow into yourself. And I love this for you. But it's just the only way I can say is it's sweet and it's nice and it's refreshing. And it's just like it's like a breath of fresh air in the midst of like all the things that I normally read. Cause I read fantasy and usually like, young adult fantasy,
Mm,
right? So it's just like much heavier topics, but I am enjoying seeing a character where she's just like, I'm just trying to get through this really big
yeah.
day, you know?
Yeah.
And I don't know, I feel like that's meaningful in the sense of like I feel like we live in an era where so many books are aiming to be important books.
Mm,
And I think there are a lot of important books that connect with the reader in ways outside of a lesson that has to be learned in the obvious sense. It's more like it connects to you because what she's going through, what she's dealing with is something that we can all relate to, understand,
mm.
and be like, yeah, I remember that, even if you're not in middle school anymore. But I am so far removed from middle school, I can't pretend to know what a middle schooler will feel when they read this book. But
Yeah.
if I had a middle schooler in my life who liked to read, I would definitely be like, hey, this one,
Oh,
you know?
yeah. No, for sure. Like it's funny. I feel like that's kind of why like books like romance are having a moment, it's because like you can have those really heavy, serious topics in certain books, but then at the end of the day, maybe you just want to go home and like chill and watch two people fall in love. And not saying that those books aren't important, but they are important in a different way. And I think just like having both is I don't know, is a positive thing.
Absolutely. I think, and this is something that I have always said on my channel, and it's something that I will continue to say on my channel, on all my platforms. There's space for both to exist.
Mhm.
Like, you need important books. You need books that tackle heavy topics. You need books that go there, but you also need books that don't.
Yeah.
You also need books that are just fun
Yeah.
and you can get a laugh, or like you said, watch two people fall in love,
Mm.
and then you're like, oh, and you can kick your feet and you can laugh, and you don't have to be prepared and on guard in
Mm.
order to read the book. And I think especially when it comes to Black authors and Black readers, sometimes that can get lost in the discussion and the nuance of conversations,
Mhm.
where it's just like sometimes it can feel like it has to be A or Z. All important books or no important books. It's just like, we can have both.
Yeah.
Why not both?
Yeah. No, people forget that it's work to read about your own experience, especially when it's not always like a positive lived experience. And it's like maybe maybe we just want to read about two Black kids falling in love as well. So I like the idea that there's both and there's room for both. And yeah.
Yeah. I think we deserve escapism
Mhm.
as well.
Absolutely.
Um, And we're going to leave that there because I can definitely get passionate about that. But I did want to ask you, having written for both audiences, one, do you have a preference for writing young adult versus middle grade, or is it just 100% dependent upon the story that comes to you?
I think it is dependent on the story. Like there are times in my life where I feel like, oh, I want to write a romance, or I have this character that's a little more like cynical and like angry, and sometimes that lends itself more to YA. And so I'm like, oh, I think that's going to be a YA story. Other times it's like, no, I want to write more about like family driven topics, and I want to write stories about like big hearted stories, like I said before. Just depends on what the story is, what the story needs. It's definitely not one or the other. It's each one in its own time, kind of.
I'm always curious about that because I know that I'll say, at least since I've been paying attention to it, like I'm not going to pretend to know the history of the entire world, right? But I think something that I've noticed is a lot more authors, who have been, you know, recognized, I guess, for writing in a specific age range, shifting to, either adult or middle grade, shifting up or down.
Mm.
And so I was just kind of interested in how that works for you, especially since you've done it and you've done it successfully both in YA and middle grade. Because I know some people are like, oh, this is where I'm trying to go,
Yeah.
right? Versus this is the story and this is what it fits,
Mhm.
and like being able to live in both
Yeah.
worlds, you know?
Yeah. And honestly, like the market does play a role. Like you're talking about authors shifting up and down. A lot of it sometimes is like the passion and like, oh, I really want to tell these types of stories. But sometimes it's also about like the market and what's selling. And I know that like it's a really difficult market for, especially for Black authors at the moment. And so
Mm.
sometimes we might like, I don't know, I've had conversations with my agent where we're like, oh, maybe it's a good time to focus more on the MG you've been working on, or maybe it's a good time to go out with the YA. Like, just it depends on the market. And sometimes, unfortunately, that sort of dictates what authors can do.
That's fair because at the end of the day, it's a job, it's a business,
Mhm.
and you got to make money from it. So I fully understand that.
Yeah.
So I guess, and this is a question that I have, right? But I don't know how much you would be able to talk about it. But you mentioned that it being a bad market, right?
Mm.
So can I ask why? Because I'm indie, right?
Oh.
So it's just like if whatever I write, that's what it's going to be for the most part. But having talked to, traditionally published authors and kind of paying attention to the ups, the downs, and what other people are doing, just to stay informed, I recognize that I'm also on the outside of things. And so I'm curious as to what would make it a bad market for Black authors in the young adult space.
Yeah, I mean, I am no expert on this either, but I think that, like, when you look at the books that are selling or the books that are on like the New York Times list and things like that, there was a moment where like a lot of Black books were getting bought or getting a lot of attention. And now it's sort of going back to the status quo. And it's a
Mm.
lot of like, white, straight authors that are filling the spots, which is a choice. Like that's good as well, but it doesn't leave a lot of space for BIPOC authors. So I kind of tend to think that it sort of depends how things are being received in the world. And I think that if we look at how there was a push for diversity a few years ago, sometimes
Yeah.
sometimes it's bit like I've heard people say like it's a trend and now diversity is over, and unfortunately a lot of publishers did treat it that way. And so now we're left with like a lot of people who have stories for Black audiences or Black characters, and people are like, nah, we have our Black author, or no, we don't, we're not interested in those stories. It's sad that it's sort of reverted back to how it was, but I think that aspect of the market plays a role too in what authors are able to do.
No, that's valid. It's definitely something that, as someone, like I said, who pays attention, I'm not part of the conversations and I definitely acknowledge that, right? But it's always kind of disappointing to see when it's just like, oh, we don't have to do this anymore. It's like we can get away with it. And it's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about uplifting Black authors and having the Melanin Library and doing all the things that I do, because I'm like, we exist, we take up space, and it shouldn't be relegated to whether or not someone else decides if you should be seen or not,
Mhm.
you know? And I just, it's frustrating, I guess, even from the outside, because I'm like, I want all the stories. I want authors to be able to take up space unapologetically and to can be able to continue to write stories and make a career out of it without having to worry about whether or not they have to go back to, a 9 to 5,
Mm.
right? To be paid fairly and all of that.
Mm.
But that's neither here nor there. World doesn't revolve around what Chelsea wants. So
Yeah. I have questions actually. I was like, I don't know very much about the indie market. So, is it a more open space for Black books and like Black books featuring Black characters? Or is it going through its own sort of push for diversity that isn't really being received well? Or like, what's going on there?
I would say that indie has always been a more welcoming
Mm.
space, mostly because they're, for better or for worse, and I don't mean this negatively, but there are no gatekeepers to indie publishing. It's more so, are you going to do this and are you willing to do this, to put in the work?
Mm.
And I personally have found that if you are willing to market, willing to network, willing to do the things that I'm sure you have to do as a traditionally published author as well to, get your name, your face, your book into certain spaces, into certain hands to, do interviews
Yeah.
and, reach out to people and do the work. I personally have found that you're likely to reach the readers who are looking for you, because I know that, like, with my books, I've sold thousands of copies of them. And it's just one of those things where it's just like, okay, there's a market for this. There are people who want this.
Mm.
It's more so just, how do I let them know? How do I build my platform and position myself as an author to let them know? Because unless you have a 9 to 5 or you have a unique circumstance, right? You don't have this huge budget behind you that I think a lot of authors kind of hope for with traditional publishing, which again, having done the podcast for a couple of years, talked to several authors, I know that even that is not always promised. So definitely, I think a more welcoming space, because I think to a certain degree, a certain type of reader kind of expects diverse authors to be in the indie space to a certain extent,
Okay.
only because, as you said, with traditional publishing, sometimes there are places that are like, we already have our Black author. And that's kind of the narrative that I know a lot of authors are kind of afraid of
Yeah.
when it comes to how to publish their book. It's a thing that they have to think about, consider, contend with,
Yeah. I mean, that is encouraging that there is like that openness and that willingness to sort of explore and for people to like, I don't know, one of the things we were told in traditional publishing, especially like a decade ago, was, oh, there's no audience for books about Black characters. And clearly, like in indie publishing, what it's showing is that there is an audience. It's just about reaching them and getting people excited about your books and things like that. So,
Absolutely. I think within the indie space, there's room to tackle different types of storytelling that might not always be accepted in the traditional space. One of the ones that I always shout about is Bones to the Wind by Tatiana Obi. It's very action packed, it's very long, but it's so good. It's amazing. One of the best books that I've read, right? But it's also like I can understand why traditional spaces probably wouldn't have been a huge fan because of the book being the way the book is broken up into the duology is broken up, right? There are certain aspects of it, and it's very black. It's very black. It's very action packed. It's very fun, right? But I think there are certain aspects of things that I think have to be have to be presented a certain way. So I think there's a lot of room to experiment. And I know that as an indie author, I definitely have fun being able to just like format my books and get the covers a certain way. And there are so many little details that go into putting together a book, right? That I'm just kind of like, I don't know. I enjoy the indie space personally. I think there are definitely benefits to being traditionally published, but I think there are benefits to being indie published as well.
yeah, I am in awe of indie authors because there's so much that goes into it, and it's like I barely make it to like signings or whatever. Like I'm just hanging on by a thread, but like it's yeah, it's phenomenal. Like to be able to put together like covers and your own publicity and like yeah, it's crazy.
It is definitely work. So if you're listening to this, you'll know that I'm a fan of being an indie author, but I will say that it is not for everyone, and take the publishing route that works for you. Indie publishing isn't for everyone, traditional publishing isn't for
For
everyone.
sure.
You have to make those decisions for yourself. There are benefits to both, there are drawbacks for both. Just you have to choose which basket you're going to put your eggs
Yeah.
in, and that's okay. But that being said, I do have a couple more questions that I would like to ask you. And one of them is, if you could choose what lasting effect your work would leave on people, what would it be?
I would hope that my books would be familiar to people in the sense that like they ring true. I always think about if there was like the apocalypse happened and like aliens came to Earth and they like and like they only had this one copy of my book. And I hope that like if they opened it and read it, it would be like, oh, like this was what life was like in 2024 for a Black girl who lives with her family, who does this, whatever it is, that it just represents what the struggles and joys and the truth of being alive and being a human right now feels like.
That's such a pretty answer, Sarah. Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay. I love it. What writing advice would you give to any new authors just now starting out on their writing journey?
I think it's the same advice that I'm sort of learning now, which is like finish what you start. Because
Oh,
it's so hard to do that. It's like you get distracted, you get bored of your story, you start to like wonder if it's gonna go anywhere. You're tired of it. You're like, there's so many reasons to stop a story, and pushing through and making your way to the end is really important. And it's a good skill, but it also like you can't do anything with a half complete manuscript. but you can edit one that is finished. You can trunk one that is finished. You can try to sell one that is finished. There's just so many more options if you finish what you start. And I think the second piece of advice, if I may, is that the love of writing. Like, it's really easy to forget that like writing is the thing you love about being in the industry and get distracted with like the publishing aspects and all the things that bring us down about publishing, and it it can be a big distraction. But if you just protect that love of the art and love for the actual act of sitting down and writing on your computer every day or on your notebook or whatever, that to me is like a sacred, and I feel like that's what ultimately keeps a career going.
That is a word. Like, okay, so y'all listening to this, y'all know that I do this to share knowledge and things with you guys. But also, as an author myself, I need y'all to understand that just hit me so hard. Just like, okay, like you just know my whole life right now. Thanks. Appreciate it. But I have been struggling for a while, and I've been like very vocal about sharing this on like my YouTube channel and platforms and things about finishing my latest project. And I can see the end in sight now, but who buddy, finishing it like that, you have to remember that you can do things with a finished manuscript. You can edit it. You can do whatever you need to do with it. You can't do anything with a project that's not complete. So you have to finish it. And this is like, oof, that in and of itself is a word, but also, you know, that second piece where you have to protect your love of writing, that I feel like that is something for sure, not necessarily if you are a brand new writer, for sure don't lose it, but also a reminder if you're an experienced author, if you've been here and it's just like, especially as indies, because like you said and like we've talked about, there's so much that goes into it. There's so much like marketing, and there's so much, you are responsible for every little aspect, the formatting, the font, the seam breaks, the cover, the summary on the back, how you present it to people. There's so many moving parts of putting together and presenting a book. But at the end of the day, remembering that the reason you did this, the reason we do the hard things is because we enjoy the part where we get to sit down and write and create, and keeping that sacred and not losing that in the journey and the mishmash of making this a career.
Yeah.
Like, that's crazy, especially if you're an entrepreneur, because I know that, speaking for myself, I can't speak for anybody else, right? But I know there are a lot of things in my life that demand time. And for better for worse, writing is usually the thing that gets put off, because I'm like, I can do that whenever I want. I can get up at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
and decide that I'm going to write, right? I can't get up at 2 a.m. and decide that I'm going to do an interview. That's not how that works. But keeping it sacred is so important. And if you take nothing else from this podcast episode, which there's plenty of good nuggets that you should take with you, for sure, take that. I just second it wholeheartedly. But that being said, we are coming up on the end of our episode. So, Sarah, if you could let the people know where they can find you on the interwebs, I will close this out.
Okay, so I'm Sarah Everett. I'm the author of several books for young readers, including The Shape of Lost Things, which comes out October 22nd. You can find out where to buy my books at saraheverettbooks.com, or you can find me on Instagram. I'm at Hey Sarah Everett. Always forget that one. Hey Sarah Everett. That's it. Thank you so much for having me, Chelsea.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing so much with us. You guys know, if you're listening to this, there'll be links down in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the description box. And by the time you guys see this, her book will already be out. So go get it. Go get it. Go get it. Y'all know that it's on the Melanin Library, and there'll be links to all of it down there. So click all of them. Click all of the links. Okay. But that being said, that is it for this episode of the Written in Melanin podcast. If you like to support this podcast, then please share it with someone you think may enjoy it. Join the Patreon at patreon.com/written in melanin. Grab a copy of my books from my website, cmlockhart.com, or donate to the podcast so that we can continue making episodes for you guys. There are links in the show notes for everything, or the description box if you're on YouTube. And thank you guys again so much for listening. Until next time, I hope all your books are full of melanin.